Do you like your horror movies with a little bit of historical context? Then you might like 8 by Silver, also known as The Cursed. This one is directed and written by Sean Ellis and stars Boyd Holbrook, who you may know from Logan. And like I said, this is kind of takes inspiration from a real historical event, albeit this is a fictionalized story. Now, in France, in the kind of, I believe it was the mid-19th century, there was a rash of killings by a kind of an animal, and it killed a lot of people. Reports vary from 100 to 600 people killed by large wolves or a singular wolf, it's not quite sure. And a lot of people in that time kind of put this down to a werewolf. Obviously, this is kind of superstitious times and things. There have actually been a number of movies made about this, probably most notably Brotherhood of the Wolf that starred Mark Dacascos and Christoph Gaines. Now, this movie, The Cursed, isn't an adaptation of that, but it's kind of like takes place in what happens afterwards. So this is kind of like the next kind of chapter, so to speak, of that, which is this didn't actually happen, but it's inspired by those kind of two events. Now, in the real event, obviously, the animals were eventually kind of hunted down, but in this universe, it has more of a kind of a supernatural element to it. So what is the story, you might be asking? Well, it's ultimately down to a land dispute between this group of Romany gypsies that have a legal claim to this particular kind of stretch of land in France, and these kind of like, these wealthy landowners who want them off their land. And they slaughter these gypsies in horrific fashion, but the gypsies get their own back by putting a curse on, this kind of the people of this kind of town, and this particular kind of guy who is the kind of the head of this kind of this sort of community, and ultimately affects the children, and everyone's kind of having these dreams of this gypsy woman and kind of the curse and this sort of scarecrow, which is pretty gruesome, which I won't spoil for you. And there's a kind of an artifact, which are these kind of silver teeth that are kind of something to do with it. And the kind of children are drawn to this kind of area and kind of dig up this teeth and kind of unleash this curse, really. And it's up to this this kind of, I guess he's like a paleontologist or something like that, played by Boyd Holbrook, to try and kind of figure out what's kind of going on. He has a connection to the original attack, which is to say the one that is based on historical fact, albeit it wasn't obviously werewolves, it was just wolves. But for the sake of this kind of movie, the kind of the gypsies that were involved in the original kind of incident have moved on to this new area and have kind of done another curse essentially. So this kind of curse obviously is now affecting pretty much everyone in this area, and we have kind of a virus-like werewolf disease where if you get bitten and survive, you're turning into a kind of werewolf-style creature. Now, what will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what do we think of The Cursed. Okay, I actually got to say this is a pretty damn good movie with great production values. It's a period piece, takes place, as I say, in the late 19th century, but does have a kind of a few flash forwards to the beginning of the 20th century. But it's a lavish production, and it looks like it has a reasonable budget, to be honest. The production design here, the production value looks excellent. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of period kind of drama type things, if I'm completely honest with you. It's obviously harder to relate, it's not in kind of my life experience, so to speak. But I gotta say, I thought it was such a lavish production. It kind of does look a lot like the Brotherhood of the Wolf movie that I've already mentioned in some ways. So I think the actual production design here is gorgeous. There's some fantastic photography here of these kind of like these misty kind of landscapes that do look haunting. Fabulous kind of sound design where we kind of hear these creatures kind of in the distance kind of howling and rustling about, I have to say. I think that things like the costumes are excellent, these kind of like period era costumes, makeup effects, all look fantastic. And I've got to say, I think the cast all do an excellent job as well. I think Boyd Holbrook makes for a kind of a likeable kind of leading man, and he's kind of, we don't know much about him, he's kind of a somewhat of a kind of a mystery and a bit of an enigma. We get a little bit of kind of backstory of him as the kind of the movie progresses, but he is sort of a stranger and a kind of a strange man. But I think everyone does a good job here, and they cast pretty well. There's some interesting kind of design work in regards to kind of these like the special effects. The creature design is kind of a werewolf, but slightly kind of different. I don't want to go spoil too much for you, but they kind of look a little bit more. They're monstrous, but not necessarily like less wolf-like. They're just kind of more, you know, animalistic creatures, if that makes sense, rather than kind of wolves exactly. But we also have some kind of other interesting effects here as well. The process that kind of befalls people before they actually turn into these creatures is pretty interesting, and they're almost kind of like wrapped in these kind of vines and things, and it's, again, I like the design here. Then we have this creepy ass scarecrow that is really only ever seen in sort of dreams really, but nonetheless it's kind of pretty good, and I think looks suitably kind of creepy here. I feel the story is reasonably predictable, to be honest with you, but nonetheless I think it's still a gripping one. You know, and we have some pretty gruesome prosthetic effects in regards to some of the kind of these injuries that are sustained through this kind of these creatures, and how they're kind of so vicious and obviously animalistic, as you'd probably expect. And there's some exciting action sequences, and I gotta say, you know, it's pretty thrilling when we do get these kind of like these sequences that are between the kind of like the man and beast, so to speak. What doesn't work for me, as I mentioned, the story is somewhat predictable. To be honest, you can kind of pretty much guess who's going to live, who's going to die. I didn't feel it was necessary to have these bookends of the kind of the 20th century. It almost kind of undercut a little bit of the tension, because you know a certain character is going to be okay in that section. I never really understand why filmmakers do this. You know, have these kind of like sequences in the future that are clearly like, oh, well, this character's going to be fine, so there's no real tension. You know that character's going to make it out of whatever you're watching. So I don't really like that, but there you go. Maybe they could have just had that at the end, but they didn't. What else? I've got to say, I think some of the character work here is a little basic. For example, you know, we have our patriarchal kind of like landowner who is bad, and he just wants to kind of like, you know, kill the gypsies and things like that, so doesn't really show any remorse. So you know he's going to obviously come face to face with some retribution and things like this. So there's not a lot of kind of like nuance with our characters, I have to say. They're kind of either you know, completely innocent, or they are pretty kind of diabolical. There's no real in between. And as I say, Boyd Holbrook's character is a little bit of an enigma, but it's somewhat of a typical kind of you know, stranger in a strange land kind of trope. And finally, that I would say, even though I think the practical effects are very strong here, we have kind of digital effects for the actual creatures themselves, and they're kind of, you know, when they're kind of moving around. And I have to say, they kind of remind me of like the original Underworld, or if you've seen the movie Van Helsing, that kind of level of CGI effects, which for the time that those original films came out, i.e. Underworld and Van Helsing, you know, maybe acceptable for that time of you know, the years. But 2021, when this movie sort of came out, I gotta say the CGI effects kind of look a little bit outdated, to be honest with you, which is a shame, because they kind of stand out amongst the rest of the movie, which has got such a high production value, and you know, the prosthetic effects look fantastic, and then you have these CGI kind of creatures that I don't think really look all that good. And we do have a prosthetic one. I don't know, maybe I would have kind of worked around that a little bit, but you know, it is what it is. Overall though, I've got to say, this is certainly a decent movie, well worth a watch. If you liked Brotherhood of the Wolf, it doesn't completely follow on from that one, because Brotherhood, there was nothing actually kind of supernatural in it, whilst there kind of is in this one. But it's an interesting kind of like inspired by true events type movie. So it's a 7 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.